So let's start this morning by quickly working our way through this rather interesting and odd-sounding story. And biblical scholars seem to struggle to understand the role this scene plays in the larger gospel narrative. Now, in Matthew's account, the transfiguration occurred 6 days after. Perhaps it's a remembering of the 6 days the cloud blanketed Mount Sinai before speaking to Moses. Perhaps it was the 6th day after Jesus' first prediction of his passion and his rebuke to Peter. But what we know, what is certain, is 6 days after something occurred. And what follows the story is this continuation of Jesus' ministry in and around Galilee. And it now includes a different dimension. It includes his prediction about the passion and his impending journey to Jerusalem. There's a shift in his voice, in his message. Transfiguration Sunday is the final Sunday of Epiphany, and it literally points us into Lent. And as Jesus comes down this mountain, his journey now includes betrayal and arrest and trial and resurrection. Transfiguration in the Greek is metamorphio and is defined as to change into one form to transform. Verse 2 says he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun. So I invite you to leave and look directly in the sun after church. And his clothes became dazzling white. And then two significant historical figures show up. There was Moses, and Moses was one of the folks who spoke directly to God. And the other, Elijah, who was visited by God in a still small voice. So Moses and Elijah represent, are symbolic of the law and the prophets, whom Jesus came not to destroy, but to fulfill. It has also been noted that Moses was the one who died, and Elijah did not die. So it may be the representation of both the living and the dead, for all are under the care of God. So Peter reacts with an idea, because usually when something weird happens, we want to do something. And his idea was to build a booth, and it seems odd to us that Peter's idea was to build a booth, but the New Testament scholars suggest that it's an appropriate response to what is quite literally an epiphany, a manifestation of the divine. And Peter's wishes to make a booth, a tent, a tabernacle to which would offer lodging for these significant religious figures. But before the idea got developed, a voice came from heaven interrupting Peter, cutting him off, to simply pronounce that Jesus is the beloved, the blessed one. And there is only one thing Peter, the disciples, and even we today, the one thing that is needful is simply to listen. Listen to him. And then Jesus says what to them? Don't be afraid. We know what fear does to us. Don't be afraid, and it's time to go back down the mountain and get on with our journey. And then he says, just don't tell anybody until after the resurrection. So this story is an important lesson for the disciples. It showed them that Jesus was God's Son and superior to the end-of-time figures of Moses and Elijah. It showed them that Jesus will triumph over suffering and death, and that he would usher in the kingdom of God with glory. But even despite the learning of these lessons, despite of the assurance and guidance, the disciples were still afraid of the transfiguration, afraid of the passion, and afraid of even the empty tomb. And only after Jesus had risen would Peter, James, and John begin to understand this story. Okay, so all this information is interesting enough, and it aids us in understanding kind of the context of what, when, how kind of questions. But as I tarried with this story, I finally realized that merely understanding the story, getting the information kind of all lined up in an order, left me feeling uninspired and disengaged. Now, I have to acknowledge, and it won't be a surprise to many of you, that I'm not a very literal person when it comes to reading the Bible, and that results in me being a little bit suspicious of stories like this one, stories that are so filled with drama. I don't do drama well. And stories like the Transfiguration seem pretty needless to me. Why not just get to the point? Why dazzling white? Why not just like ordinary white or eggshell white? Why so descriptive to stir up in me why drama is needed? So don't get me wrong, I don't mind understanding and learning and about how it all connects, but the literal meaning of these kinds of stories drive me crazy, or drive me crazier than I already am, and it makes very little sense to me because I don't do the drama well. So I often question the necessity of paying much attention to what sounds so much like fiction and fantasy. So in the quiet time of the early morning, sipping on my tea, watching the morning sky and Molly wake up, the deeper questions surface. Why is this story relevant today? And how does this story make my faith more relevant? So I had a picture come into my mind. You're sitting around the table enjoying a good meal and having engaging conversation with 6 or 8 people who really matter to you, and without assuming motivation, Pat, Bob, John speaks up and says, okay, so I've always wondered how this Transfiguration story is relevant for you Christians today. And immediately everyone looks at you, because you attend Pine Shores, one of the best churches in the community, if not the entire country. So you have the answer. And Pat doesn't want you to explain it away. She simply wants to hear how this story of the Transfiguration is relevant for Christians in today's world. And I want us to answer Pat's questions because it's worthy of a response. Now, before we get way too involved and hopefully discovered the relevancy, let me say that there is no easy answer to Pat's question. If 37 years of ministry has taught me anything, is that you can't fake an answer, particularly if someone is trying or maybe trying to live more Christ-like. You can't fake an answer even if they're trying to bait you into defending your beliefs or goading you into becoming defensive about what they believe. They know you're faking when you have all the right words, but there's no meaning in your sentences. The answer is not on page 356 in the Westminster Confession of Faith, nor can you find it on a bumper sticker at the Christian bookstore. And Pat's question might feel very threatening because we may not have an authentic and empowering answer, but it's still a good question. So first, let's just go ahead and acknowledge the fact that we are impacted by the cultural forces bidding for our hearts and minds. There's no judgment about those forces, at least not in this sermon, but it's our world, and we cannot dismiss how we are impacted by the influence of cultural norms, practices, values, and goals. Media and technology are exceptionally powerful forces and produce value systems. Distorted and disruptive capitalism and coercive consumerism also produce value systems that influence our perception and participation, or lack thereof, of being faithful. And we can't get away from all those forces dominating our thoughts. So we just simply have to acknowledge the fact that we are impacted by the values of the culture in which we live in. They are interwoven in our interpretations. Postmodernism might be one of those influences. Pluralism, relativism, and meta-narrativism. I read that we live in a culture without faith, a culture willingly disconnected from the faith that gave its life in its first place. And thus, ultimately, we live in a fragile and fragmented culture. And this has led many of those influenced by culture to a generalized loss of faith and to a pathology of individualism and ingratitude as they attempt to live in isolation from their fellows, unprepared to recognize the world they live in and its privileges they enjoy as God's gifts. The fact is that we are greatly impacted by our culture and how we understand and read the Bible. We live in a conflicting and complicated time. And so we have to acknowledge that those values and influence answer how this story is relevant for us today. So to help us discover some relevancy, I want to offer a few foundational interpretive assumptions. So if you take all the special effects away, the story is intended to support the identity of Jesus as one intimately connected with God. This is my beloved, and I am well pleased. So that Jesus' ability to embody, to carry out, if you like, the divine mission here on earth in human form helps us visual learners how to live as God desires. Jesus teaches us about living a more meaningful life, and that's relevant. Another foundational assumption is the phrase, listen to him. And these simple three words identify Jesus as a messenger of God. Not a messenger of media or technology, a messenger from God. So Jesus has something significant, essential to say about how to live a more meaningful life, and that's relevant. And the third foundational interpretive assumption is the words Jesus says, get up. And it suggests that we need to come down from the mountain and be the human presence of Christ today in a fearful and broken world to a hurting and excluded people, offering the touch of new life. Jesus instructs us that a more meaningful life includes being connected to others, and that's relevant. And then he just simply says, don't be afraid. And that's the assurance that God is present, always present in whatever happens next, no matter how frightening the circumstance, no matter how destructive the circumstance. Jesus promises that his life and their life will be forever intertwined, from the top of the mountains to the shadow of the valley of the shadow of death. or someplace in between. Lo, I am always with you. So Jesus teaches us about living a more meaningful life. Jesus has something to say about living a more meaningful life. Jesus instructs us that a more meaningful life includes caring for each other. Jesus assures us that we do not have to be afraid. So there's the answer to Pat's question. Now, she might dispute it. She might disagree with it. She might flat out reject it. But Jesus shows us what God desires for our living. And there is a relevancy in living as God desires. Think about it. Think about if we lived as God desires, what kind of world this would be. And Jesus' words help us get on that path that God desires, and that's relevant. And we do not have to be afraid that our actions are to be intentionally Christ-like, and that is relevant. The story is relevant because as a people of faith, living Christ-like makes us relevant and makes our lives more meaningful and significant. So let's not be distracted by the weird special effects and limit our attention to trying to explain the weirdness away. It seems to me that if we pay attention to Jesus' words and his teachings and his assurance, we'll have much to learn about justice and faith and compassion and fairness. If we listen to Jesus, we will find ourselves transformed in our thinking about his ministry and his mission and our mission to the world to let the light of God shine in us. So we do not stroll blandly through our lives, oblivious to what Jesus is saying. And perhaps the relevancy is relevant when we are impacted so much that we hear Christ call to see that justice is done, that compassion is embodied, that care for one another becomes the value. So, Pat, I know you are not listening, whoever Pat is. You may not be listening, and you may not like our answer, or you might be on the TV because then the volume's turned up too loud, or you're posting on your online family or ordering Cards Against Humanity or spec blocks off your Prime Amazon. You may be relying on your stock market for the future or watching a repeat of the Super Bowl Sunday halftime show in slow motion. You may be counting on others who may not be responsive and reliable, but we're relevant because we know the more excellent way. We know how to live a more meaningful life, a Christ-like life. And Pat, whoever you are, we invite you to join in our journey.